Back again with Jersey Dude and part number 4 of Pieced Patches, Big Patch Small Machine. Here we have our St. John Sea Dog. We're in Janome MBX V5 digitizer. And if you look at this guy again, you should start to be able to identify the pattern. And if you look at one of the designs I've done in the split method, you should be able to start spotting them right away. We do modify the existing designs to make this happen, but in reality, we're not adding anything that is abnormal to a patch in general, only to these in particular. These interior satin stitch lines don't really look out of place unless you look at the original design, which is different, obviously, since it does not have these. You can clearly see how this guy comes apart now, and when I pick that front piece, it will be quite obvious that there it is. You can see this is just left rough and left underneath far enough that there is quite an overlap. You can see underneath here in the pink lines. There's enough overlap that you won't have any problems putting the two pieces together. We can spend a little bit of time here talking about the types of stitching that are in here. If you look at this blue around the outside here, that's a very complex shape. You would have a fair amount of difficulty stitching that as a solid object from the closed shape tool. Really, it is the type of object that lends itself very well to the digitized blocks. You can see, yes, the outside gray is made up of digitized blocks, and so too are the blue areas. That has the advantage of very easily and by default setting the stitch angles as you draw them. For instance, this piece here where the stitching bends around, if you draw your nodes directly across from each other, you've automatically set the stitch angles to follow in kind. And that has some benefit in that you are randomizing the push-pull in your stitching. So too is it easier to use the digitized block when you are doing a satin line with varying widths. It's very time consuming to sit and straighten these arcs out. It's virtually impossible to draw them as perfect, smooth, flowing arcs right off the bat. You have to come back in and fiddle with them, and it takes a good eye and a strong sense of shape and flow to get those in the right manner. But it's possible, and it really is the best way to create those varying width satin stitch lines. One of the places where you run into trouble is getting out to points. If you were to try to make this out of one piece, you would have multiple stops and starts. If you made that whole blue area, for instance, out of a closed shape, the machine would be running all over the place as it perhaps sewed perpendicular to here and then jumped over in the corner and finished this way and then came down. Maybe it would continue there, maybe it would wander off somewhere else. It would be all over the place. It really can get a bit chaotic in terms of the stitch out. So using the digitized block is an advantage in that regard. You can create flowing stitch lines, and that lends a bit of that visual interest I'm always talking about. You have these little overlap areas where the two pieces come together. It does simplify the stitch out, and really it doesn't show all that much in reality, but it shows a little bit. It's visually interesting. It doesn't really detract from the design much at all. So I'm sure you're beginning to see these patterns as you look at these now. And yes, we do have this guy ready to stitch out. Should be a pretty easy job. Let's look at a different design. This is our friend, the Orlando Solar Bear. This is another design that they used. This was one of their main crest patches for the front of the jerseys. And yes, once again, you can start to see the pattern fairly quickly. Now it can be a bit of a puzzle exactly how many pieces is this guy sewn in. Using the notion that we're trying to keep things small, you have to start looking at it in terms of width. Items that are extremely wide will be the ones that will govern and limit what you can do. So, for instance, it should be fairly obvious that this banner down here that says Solar Bears is going to be a piece. That's pretty quick to discover. Now, you might even go so far as to start looking and saying, well, you could divide this part of the sun out from underneath the bear's head. And yes, you absolutely could do that. That would be perfectly doable if you found it advantageous to you. This is actually getting quite wide and will end up, the bear himself will end up being the major portion of the entire patch. And so trying to limit the width of that portion of it will become key. When I move these things around, you will also be able to note a few items underneath. When I move the Solar Bear banner out of the way, and then when I move the second piece away, there you have some funny things appearing. You see some random lines in here. Yes, they do appear to be random, but they're actually not. They're put there on purpose. One of the things that is a little tricky about putting these things together is that it makes perfect sense when you're looking at it until you stitch it out and find the pieces, and then you have to figure out how to get them together, and alignment can be a bit difficult. And so underneath, right next to the forearm, I've put a guide line. That is a single run stitch line that sits right where the forearm will attach and sit in order to line up properly. And so when you bring that forearm in, you can ease it in, align it to the shape, looks pretty good, bring it over a little further to cover it, and there's your alignment. You're using that line as a visible guide when you put it together. So that becomes very helpful. You also see one guideline is not going to do it for you. You have to have at least 2 points in order to line things up properly. So you can see where his knuckles are on his hand. There is another guideline sewn in the part that will be underneath, and you can see bringing in the forearm and getting it lined up, and then bringing it up to line up the knuckles on the hand with those lines. Those will be very helpful when it comes time to putting this whole thing together. And this guy here, this whole banner, also has a small line over on this side for alignment. This side would be very tricky, but there's an alignment point for that area to fit into so that you can get this all put back together in the proper position. Again, we have another image, and you really should be getting good at spotting the technique by now. The original designer did not divide this area off with this continuous line across the top. His satin stitch border came down and turned here and went down around this area and then around the end of the plane like that. It doesn't look out of place at all really to have these things separated. It does alter the design slightly, but it's not that problematic unless you're looking at the original versus this copy at the same time. Then you can clearly note the differences. So now, looking at this, judging the techniques that I've been speaking of, you should be able to spot where the pieces are and how they're going to go together. So it should not be any surprise to you when I move them. There's one thing before I do that you should see straight off. There's one glaring item that makes no sense at all, and that's this open stitch through the back. Why is that there? That doesn't make any sense at all. That should not be there. Well, no, not in this version. The way this is sewn or drawn, this is improper. However, this is meant to stitch on black fabric. Anything you see black within the confines of the border stitching is the background fabric. And so, what that line is back there is a guideline. That is a guideline to place this circle in the proper orientation when it's time to put the pieces together. So, since this will be sewn on its own piece of black fabric, it will cover that line completely and it'll never show. You should have already figured out very obviously that this was a separate piece as well. So we have taken this patch that would have been much too large to sew as one piece, and we've made it 3. Now this entire bit all put together is 12.5 by 11.3. That size is governed by the size of the individual pieces. That's 11.7 in width. This is where you run into the limits that you can get out of this technique. Now, my frame is 11.3, and so this piece is too large. This is the limiter in the entire design. And so you're wondering, how can I sew this? This is one piece of this patch at 11.7. Well, when it comes time to sew it, it's actually going to get turned, and you'll watch the width going down. By the time I rotate it up to, about there would work. Now it's only 7.2 by 11.1. That's within the confines of my stitch frame, and so it'll work just fine. That's the last little bit of gamesmanship that you pull when you put these multiple pieces together to make one big patch.